Okay, let's get started. Man can only relate with the God he can see. One of the things we've talked about in the past is that throughout human history, when man can't see a God, when man has no concept of God, they make up their own. If either it's a calf or it's a bull or it's their car, when a person doesn't have any knowledge of God, they come up with something that they elevate to that status. But throughout the narratives of the Bible, we find that God establishes covenants, which, as we've talked about, are relational agreements with men, which continually unveil new sides or new facets of God. We serve an infinite God. Nobody, I don't care how deep you are, nobody sees all of God, but God shows sides of himself to humanity throughout time. God enters into partnership with man and then entrusts humans with the task of personifying or demonstrating the revelation of God to those who he has not revealed himself. No single individual save Christ could ever carry out such a monumental task, and so God establishes communities intended to stand as institutional testaments to God as he has revealed himself in their time. So nobody, just like no one person can see all of God, no one person except for Christ is capable of personifying the character and nature of God. So he establishes communities, and through the interactions of those communities, as they deal with each other, that shows and gives an idea of who God has shown himself to be up to that point in time. Spiritual abuse, which is the key of what we've been discussing, or leading up to what we're discussing, is the mistreatment of a person who is in need of help, support, or greater spiritual empowerment, with the result of weakening, undermining, or decreasing that person's spiritual empowerment. The work of the devil, more than destroying any singular individual, is to corrupt the institutions designed to manifest God's glory, and in doing so cause these establishments to project a distorted, disfigured deity that people mistakenly identify as God. So we recognize that we're in individual battles with the devil. There's actually much more to it than that. There's a much bigger plan. As believers, if the communities that God establishes to represent him become corrupted, then what they project becomes corrupted. And we say that's God, but it's actually a distortion. And over time, over generations, the distortion becomes more and more disconnected from whom God has showed himself to be. But because we say that's God, and we take it out to people who don't see God or don't know who God is, they come to associate and identify who we've projected to actually be God. So it's a problem. And that's actually the grand scheme of what Satan does in combating believers. These distortions act as veils between God and man, barriers and obstacles that prevent the individual from seeing God as he has revealed himself and relating with him. People perceive the character of God relative to what they experience at the hands of those who claim to act on his behalf. This often falls short of the loving and empowering God that relates with humanity. You tell somebody that God is a loving God, from a biblical standpoint, God is a loving God, a lot of times they look at you funny because their experiences with God's representatives say something different. Sometimes it's their interpretation of their life experiences that says something different, but more times than not, they've seen, because either through the church experience or through interactions with believers, they've seen something other than a loving God. They've seen something other than an empowering God. They've heard through televangelists, they've heard through preachers, something other than a God that is interested in intimately relating with people. This lesson will continue to explore the functions of legitimate God-given authority and the disasters that are recorded in the Bible that result when that authority is misused. As always, we'll continue to point to the God that loves and values man immensely as we rend the veil of religious establishment. We're going to work to tear down the barriers that have been erected by the devil through the establishments and the communities that claim to be communities of God, to try to show you the loving God that the Bible talks about and the loving God that wants to intimately relate with everybody, with everyone's